Hello, my name is Margaret Ellison. I am 62 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the ocean air clings to the streets like secrets that never fully fade. Today, I am a quiet philanthropist, someone who rebuilt a life with patience and restraint, though every choice I made was shaped by silence and shadows I once endured. To understand how I became this version of myself, I must take you back to the place where I first learned what it meant to love without return. It was Ashford, Georgia, in the early 1980s, a quiet town where wood smoke floated over worn porches. My mother, Eleanor, had a voice like the hymnals she sang at dusk, teaching me how to hold faith in fragile hands. But even in the warmest homes, shadows grow quietly, and love can be replaced with betrayal. When I think of the years that shaped me, I see my grandmother's narrow house at the edge of Ashford, its windows clouded by lace curtains that smelled faintly of lavender and dust, a place most of my relatives entered only when politeness demanded it, but where I spent nearly every afternoon of my childhood. My grandmother Clara had once been the steady pillar of the family, the woman who held weddings together with her recipes and funerals with her hymns, but by the time I was 9, her health had declined so sharply that she could no longer walk without assistance. I remember kneeling on the rug to button her shoes when the others avoided eye contact, pretending they had errands too pressing to wait, and how her thin fingers would tremble as they brushed against my cheek in gratitude, a touch that felt like both blessing and plea. I learned early to wash her teacups without clattering them, to set her Bible beside the lamp where her failing eyes could still make out the thin lines of scripture, to rub her hands with lotion because the skin had grown so fragile it cracked in the winter. My cousins would run past the porch without pausing, carrying laughter like shields, while I stayed behind, pouring broth into a chipped bowl, listening to her stories of a husband gone too soon and a life that had been whittled down to memory. My mother, though kind in her own way, was stretched thin, caught between work and duty, and she often looked relieved when she saw me take the chair beside Clara's bed, as if my quiet loyalty was a convenience she had learned to depend upon. At the time, I did not see it as sacrifice. I thought it was simply love, the way a child might think the world is held together by small, invisible strings she alone must keep from snapping. Yet in the silences between Clara's fading voice, I sometimes wondered why no one else seemed willing to shoulder the same tenderness, why her sons, my uncles, would slip in only at Christmas, smelling of cologne and distance, why even my older sister feigned impatience when asked to bring water from the kitchen. Their absence became the outline of my devotion, and though I longed for their approval, I told myself that love was not about recognition, but about staying when others turned away. In that dimly lit house, I believed loyalty could fill the hollow left by neglect, never realizing that the same neglect would one day turn its gaze on me. As I grew older, the quiet work I had done for my grandmother seemed to vanish from memory, as though my devotion were an invisible language only she and I had ever spoken, and once her voice weakened further, no one else bothered to remember it at all. At family gatherings, when my cousins spoke of their achievements, I would wait for someone to mention the afternoons I spent keeping Clara's pain at bay, but the subject never came, swallowed by louder stories of new cars, promotions, and engagements. One Thanksgiving, I overheard my Yunsi say to another that I was good at playing nurse because she has nothing better to do, and though the words burned, I forced a smile, pretending it did not matter. When I offered to help with planning or spoke with quiet suggestions, my ideas were brushed aside, not with cruelty, but with a practiced indifference that told me I had already been assigned my place, useful when needed, forgettable when not. At church one Sunday, when Clara could not attend, I sat alone on the wooden pews, and a neighbor asked why my family never came with me. I answered gently that they were busy, though I felt the sting of knowing that busy was simply the name they gave their indifference. The small humiliations gathered like dust, being left out of photographs because I had stayed back to tidy the kitchen, hearing my sister joke in front of others that I was married to that rocking chair beside Grandma, even being corrected sharply by an aunt when I dared to speak about future plans, as if ambition from me sounded like insolence. I told myself these were small oversights, not rejections, and I smoothed them in my heart as one might press wrinkles from a sheet, believing that patience would make everything right. Yet late at night, when I washed Clara's cup in the sink and looked out at the dark yard, I sometimes felt a hollow widen in me, as though the more I gave, the less I existed in their eyes. The day it struck hardest was during Clara's birthday, when the family gathered in the living room with cake, laughter spilling over, and I carried her down the hall in her chair only to find they had already begun singing without us. I smiled and joined in, but in that silence before my grandmother's soft clap, I felt something tilt inside me, an unspoken warning that love alone would never be enough. The day that defined the silence of my life came not with a storm, but with a gathering that should have been a celebration, a day marked by ribbons, flowers, and applause, my daughter's wedding. The church was filled with music, the air heavy with perfume. Me and promise, and I stood among the guests as though belonging, though deep inside I carried a secret that had begun to gnaw at me in the quietest hours. The inheritance left to me by my late husband, $35 million carefully secured, a gift of loyalty and trust that I had chosen to keep unspoken, believing my family would never understand the weight of it. The ceremony unfolded with grace, but as the reception began, small details pricked at me. My name absent from the program, my seat at the back instead of near the front, the way my son-in-law's parents greeted guests as if they were the true hosts while I slipped between tables unnoticed. I tried to convince myself it was oversight, a misplacement, nothing more, but the moment that unstitched me came without warning, a toast raised high by my brother, who in a voice meant to charm, thanked every member of this family who made sacrifices to bring us here today, his words landing with deliberate pause on names that did not include mine. The applause that followed clattered in my ears, and I felt the blood rush from my hands as though I were made of glass. My daughter, radiant in her gown, glanced at me only briefly, her smile fixed, her eyes sliding past me to the crowd that adored her, and in that glance I understood something final. I had been written out of the story I helped sustain. Later that evening, as guests danced and laughter rose like smoke, I overheard a cousin whisper that I had contributed nothing, that even Clara's final years had been borne by others who cared. A lie so casually spoken it sounded rehearsed. My mouth opened, but no words came, for to defend myself in that moment felt like begging for entry into a house that had already locked its doors. I stepped outside into the cold air, the music muffled by walls, and pulled from my purse a small envelope I had carried for months. A note I once thought I might give to my daughter on this day, telling her that her future was secure because of what her father had left behind. I held it in my hand until the paper grew damp with sweat, then slipped it back, unopened, into the shadows of my bag. The night stretched on without me. When the last car pulled away and the lights of the hall dimmed, I realized no one had noticed I was gone. No one had asked if I needed a ride. No one had even looked for me. I walked home alone beneath the street lamps, the echo of my heels against the pavement louder than the silence I carried, and in that long walk I understood with a clarity that pierced me. I was no longer a part of them, not in memory, not in presence, not even in grief. In the weeks after the wedding, my world shrank to the size of the rooms I no longer wished to leave, the walls of my house pressing in with a silence so dense it felt alive, each shadow on the floor a reminder of the places at the table where I was no longer welcome. I moved carefully, as though my footsteps themselves might echo too loudly in the emptiness, and even the phone, which rang less and less, became a weight I could not lift, its unanswered messages piling like unopened letters in a drawer. Rain came often that season, streaking the windows until they blurred the garden into gray watercolor, and I found myself sitting for hours at the edge of my bed, staring at the same damp pane as if it might eventually show me what part of myself had been left behind. Food lost its taste, sleep came only in fragments, and when I caught my reflection in the mirror, I startled at the hollow under my eyes, the quiet accusation that I had given everything and received nothing but absence. Yet grief, as I learned, does not arrive as one flood, but as a series of tides, and one evening, while sorting through a stack of papers I had not touched in months, I found an envelope tucked at the back of a drawer, a letter written years earlier by my late husband, folded with the neat precision I'd always marked his hand. His words were brief but steady, reminding me that the fortune he left was not simply money, but a charge. Use it to live, not to vanish. It is not wealth if it buries you. I sat with the letter pressed against my chest, and in that moment the air in the room shifted, as though some corner of him had returned to sit beside me in the silence. For the first time in weeks, I stood, opened the curtains, and let the rain-slicked light fall across the floor, not warm, but present. I did not feel healed, nor forgiven, nor even strong, but I felt something stir that was not despair, a thin thread of resolve, as fragile as it was stubborn. I knew I could not change what had been taken from me, but I could decide what I did with what remained. Alone in that dimly lit room, with the letter trembling in my hands, I made one quiet decision. I would not disappear. The shift did not come like lightning, but like the slow turning of a tide, quiet at first, then insistent, carrying me from grief into a new kind of discipline, one born not from anger but from clarity, the steady realization that silence had nearly erased me and that I would not permit it again. I began with books, long nights at the wooden desk where my husband once paid bills, reading volumes on inheritance law, trusts, and probate codes, words that first blurred like a foreign language but gradually sharpened into tools I could hold. Each page I turned felt like stitching a seam inside myself, binding together the fragments that betrayal had torn loose. Days I once spent in isolation became hours of study, the rain at my window no longer a symbol of grief, but the rhythm against which I measured my progress. Slowly, I pieced together the paperwork my husband had left behind, examining every clause, every signature, realizing how meticulously he had protected me, and how easily that protection could vanish if I surrendered to despair. What surprised me most was not the technical knowledge, but the memory of his faith in me. His decision to entrust $35 million not to lawyers or banks alone, but to my judgment, my ability to discern when the world would try to diminish me. I began to step outside again, returning to places that once deepened my loneliness, but now I walked differently. The courthouse steps no longer felt imposing but purposeful. The church pews no longer a reminder of exclusion, but a seat from which I observed who avoided my gaze. In the library, where I spent hours surrounded by quiet stacks, I met Mrs. Whitaker, a retired clerk who noticed the pile of legal texts on my table and, without prying, offered guidance in small, steady increments. She showed me how to request records, how to interpret filings, how to trace the movement of money through public documents, and her patient tone carried no judgment, only recognition, as though she had been waiting for someone who would not waste the knowledge she had spent a lifetime gathering. With her help, I uncovered details that at first seemed irrelevant, accounts that had been opened hastily, signatures that did not match, property transfers conducted with unusual speed, but together they formed a pattern, one that suggested not only indifference but exploitation. My family, the very ones who dismissed my years of devotion, had quietly reshaped the narrative to erase me, not only in words but in paper, filing claims that diminished my role, shifting assets into their own names, trusting that I would remain too small, too silent to notice. I did not rage. I documented. I kept folders with dates, copies, annotations, my handwriting growing steadier with each discovery, as though my hand had learned the language of authority. The first legal notice I filed was not dramatic, just a request for clarification, a polite demand for transparency, but it carried the weight of every night I had sat unseen at my grandmother's bedside, every humiliation swallowed, every moment erased. Soon after, accounts that had once seemed untouchable were frozen, pending investigation. Letters arrived, not in the warm tones of family correspondence, but in the clipped, urgent voices of attorneys who suddenly recognized that I was no longer a shadow. And as the lies began to unravel, I felt no thrill of revenge, only the calm steadiness of reclaiming what had always been mine, not only the inheritance, but the dignity they thought could be buried under silence. I walked again past the hall where I had left my daughter's wedding in solitude, and this time, though the lights inside glowed with strangers, I did not feel small. I felt present, sharpened, alive, as if each step pressed my name back into the ground they once tried to erase. The day I finally spoke was not marked by spectacle but by restraint. A quiet morning when the courthouse smelled faintly of paper and dust, the marble floors reflecting the light in pale fragments as though even the building itself understood the gravity of what was about to be unsealed. I sat at the long oak table, my papers in careful stacks, my husband's letter folded once more in my bag like a hidden talisman, and when the proceedings began, I did not raise my voice or lean forward with fury. I simply laid out the truth with the patience of someone who had carried silence long enough to know that words, when precise, could cut more deeply than anger. My family, lined along the opposite bench, shifted in their seats as documents were read. Bank accounts frozen by the judge's order, transfers traced back to signatures they had hoped no one would examine, claims of guardianship and contribution dissolved under the clarity of written fact. At first they denied, their voices quick and uneasy. Then, my brother insisting that he had only helped manage what I could not handle, my sister scoffing that I had misunderstood the filings, but with each denial another page was slid across the table, another inconsistency highlighted, another witness called, and the room grew tighter with the sound of their unraveling. It was not me who delivered judgment, It was the weight of their own words collapsing against the evidence. I spoke sparingly, answering questions with calm precision, never embellishing, never pleading, only allowing the paper trail to speak for itself. And in the stillness between testimonies, I saw the faces of strangers, clerks, lawyers, even the judge, begin to shift with recognition, the unspoken acknowledgement that the woman they once dismissed as silent had been carrying the truth all along. When the will was finally read aloud, confirming not only the inheritance but the clear intent my husband had expressed, that it be entrusted solely to me, free from interference, the air in the chamber seemed to crackle, not with triumph but with finality, as though the room itself exhaled a truth too long withheld. My relatives looked down, their eyes darting from one another to the floor, and I thought of all the years I had waited for acknowledgement in living rooms, kitchens, pews, moments when I had swallowed humiliation and told myself it was not worth protest. And now here, without me lifting more than a measured sentence, the recognition arrived, undeniable and public. Assets were restored, accounts secured, their petitions dismissed with finality, and as the gavel struck, I felt no surge of victory, only a profound stillness, the kind that comes when a long storm finally breaks and the air clears, revealing the shape of the world beneath. My brother tried once more, his voice cracking, to explain that they had meant no harm, that they had assumed I would not know how to carry such responsibility. But the judge cut him short with a quiet rebuke, reminding him that an assumption was not justification, and the silence that followed weighed heavier than any apology. I gathered my papers, slid them into my bag, and stood without glancing back, for there was nothing in their lowered heads that I needed to see. Outside, the sky was pale but open, the street busy with the ordinary rhythm of life, and as I stepped into it, I realized that dignity, once reclaimed, does not need to announce itself. It simply exists, steady and undeniable, while those who once sought to erase it are left with nothing but their silence. In the months that followed, the silence that once suffocated me shifted into something different, no longer an absence but a space in which I could breathe, rebuild, and choose deliberately what deserved my attention. Light returned first in small ways, morning sun cutting through the windows of my house, falling across the floorboards that had once felt cold and empty, now bright with possibility. I cleared rooms that had been cluttered with dust and grief, repainted walls, opened windows, and let fresh air thread itself into corners where sorrow had lingered too long. The inheritance, once a secret weight, became a means not of power, but of purpose. I established a scholarship in my grandmother Clara's name, ensuring that the quiet devotion she had embodied would be remembered not as fragility, but as legacy. And when I stood in the auditorium to announce it, the applause that rose was not shallow or dismissive, but rooted in respect. My relatives, stripped of the illusions they once clung to, withdrew into themselves, their names mentioned only in whispers of pity, and though the world still offered them rooms to occupy, they no longer held the stage. Invitations began to arrive addressed to me directly, committees seeking my voice, neighbors asking for my counsel, women who had watched from a distance now approaching with questions about resilience, trust, and survival. One afternoon, a young girl from the church lingered by my side after service, her hands clasped tightly around a notebook, and in a trembling voice she asked how I had found the strength to keep standing when others turned away. I rested my hand gently over hers, feeling the weight of her question as both burden and honor, and I told her not in grand phrases, but in steady truth, that strength was not born from being seen, but from refusing to vanish when forgotten. In her eyes, I saw something I had once searched for in vain, recognition, untainted by jealousy or dismissal, and it was enough. I walked home beneath the same streets that had once carried me alone from my daughter's wedding, but now the lamps glowed with a softer light, no longer accusing, but illuminating the path forward. I understood then that while the world remained imperfect, I was no longer powerless within it. They had left me in silence, but I had returned in presence, and where once I was written out, now I carried the pen. In the beginning, I believed silence was survival, that if I stayed small enough I might still belong, but the years have taught me otherwise. Silence is where they tried to bury me, and voice is where I chose to rise. They left me outside the story, erased my name, and walked away believing I would vanish. But I did not. She was abandoned. I became the home,